Good evening. I'm Molly Duffy, and I'm the director of the Valley Forge Park Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our 2020-2021 speaker series, which is sponsored by the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation. Tonight, I'm actually glad that we're doing this online because I think it would be hard for many of us and impossible for our speaker to get to the Washington Memorial Chapel tonight. So I'm glad we can all do this in the comfort and warmth of our own homes. So I just want to start with some housekeeping items, but I think by now you're probably experts on this. Since we have several speakers this evening, I recommend that you put your Zoom session into speaker view. There's an icon in the upper right portion of your Zoom screen that should allow you to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. Speaker view is less distracting as it allows you to see only who's currently presenting. There's a Q&A chat during our webinar, and you can use that to submit questions. The Q&A chat icon is on the bottom portion of your Zoom window. So feel free to use the Q&A chat anytime during the event. You'll also see a link to our speaker's book there. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Justin Clement. Justin is a historian who has spent his whole life immersed in the living history reenacting community. A tailor of historic reproduction clothing, Clement leads the Tailoring Brigade, a group of volunteers at Valley Forge National Historical Park. He is a frequent volunteer for the Valley Forge Park Alliance, and he has relaunched the speaker series for this season. So if you're enjoying this speaker series, this is who you can thank because Justin put it together and we are very grateful to him. So more about Justin though. After earning a degree in physics, Justin went on to the College of William and Mary, completing a graduate degree in early American history. His master's thesis explored a post-war Loyalist trade diaspora following the American War for Independence. Justin is currently wrapping up his PhD in US history at the University of California, Davis. His dissertation is entitled On Both Sides by Turns, Violence, Protectionists, and the American Revolution, an appropriate topic for tonight's speaker series. Justin, welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'm very happy to be speaking today, and it's certainly a pleasure to be introducing Todd Braisted. Now, I've known Todd through living history reenacting circles during the 1990s and onward. Back at that point, I'd seen him at reenactments with the 4th Battalion New Jersey Volunteers, who he commanded. And his name always came up on Yahoo message boards where we were sharing a lot of research and collaborating at the time. And he was just one of these authorities that everyone spoke about, and occasionally they would cite some of the information that he had discovered. But I first met Todd at the David Library of the American Revolution sometime around 2000 or 2001. And I was doing genealogy work, 19-year-old kid, I come in there. And Todd comes in and he has his room all to himself, closes the door, and I just hear the microfilm printer going and just printing off for like 6 hours on end, just continuous printing of pages from microfilm. And I'm thinking, wow, this guy's really dedicated to his work. And, you know, being a cash-strapped 19-year-old kid, it was really surprising to see someone drop $50 or more on printing fees. But when we got to talking around lunchtime, I mentioned I was doing genealogical research, and I was looking for information on the Clement family, my family, and he was able to pinpoint the exact microfilm reel and the Haldeman papers and the approximate folio where I could go and find an officer's commission from one of the Clement brothers that were in Butler's Rangers. And sure enough, I look it up, it was right where he said it was. He just knew it off the top of his head. So for a long time now, I've had an enormous respect for Todd, and that was one of those moments where I knew that he was a true authority on Loyalist studies and everything that was out there to be found. He was a person you wanted to contact. Now, Todd is the founder of the Online Institute for Advanced Loyalist Studies. This is an online resource. It's at royalprovincial.com. And this site, there's all sorts of information, including unit histories for different Loyalist regiments, various timelines and transcriptions of historical documents related to Loyalists. So it's an amazing resource that I have gone to countless times in the last 20 years. But to show just how much Todd is an authority, I'll give you a good example. I was researching this individual named Charles Peters. He is an individual, a North Carolina soldier who was in the Continental Army. He was freed from slavery, and at some point he ended up with the Continental Army under General George Washington. And he was probably at Valley Forge, although the muster roll is missing for those crucial months, but he was at the Battle of Monmouth. Eventually, he's at the siege of Charleston, South Carolina, gets captured, and at that point, we lose track of him. I thought he might be the same individual that surfaces later in Massachusetts, but in my notes, my to-do list of what I should do in terms of where to go for research, I had written, contact Todd Braisted, because I knew that he might have some information. And sure enough, after the surrender of Charleston, this individual, Charles Peters, who, if I neglected to say, he is an Indian individual from the East Indies. He's from Madras, right? So a very curious individual in the Continental Army. Well, it turns out that he did indeed join in a Loyalist unit, a provincial regiment. When he was on a prison ship, he was recruited and eventually ended up in Jamaica. So he has a very interesting history, and the fact that Todd was able to look that up immediately and be able to tell me where I could find this additional part of his biography just goes to show what type of research that he has accumulated over his career. Now, over the decades, scholarship in Loyalist studies has fallen into a few trends. Right, there are those celebratory books or biographies, but within sort of the academic circles during the Cold War era, you had all these histories coming out that looked at loyalism through the lens of ideology. Right, it makes sense, right? People during the Cold War, it was capitalism versus communism, right? People have that mindset of ideology. And of course, you have all these books on loyalists, and they're all talking about ideology, ideology, ideology. But during the 1990s, you have this switch where there's this trend where they start looking at loyalism as an identity, right? Well, these trends, these historic trends in scholarship can also become traps. And Todd has always been able to cut through all of that, right? He's never fallen into these different traps. He's been able to do fairly groundbreaking research into Loyalist studies. And most recently, I've been very intrigued by his work where he's looking at those individuals who cross over from the Continental Army into a Loyalist regiment or vice versa. And it brings to mind that quote from John Adams, right, where 1/3 of Americans were Loyalists, another third were patriots, and the other third are neutrals. That quote is actually talking about support for the quasi-war with France, and it actually has nothing to do with the American Revolution. But that notion that 1/3 of Americans were loyalist, well, people have been chipping away at that, and they've tried to reduce it down to 1/5 of the population, rather than 1/3. And there's this effort where scholars do head counting, right? They will count, and if an individual shows up on a patriot militia muster, well, he gets counted in the patriot column, right? And then you have this loyalist muster roll, right? These troops that served in a provincial regiment, serving with the British Army. And if the name appears there, they get checked off, they get counted in that category. But as Todd will be talking about tonight, this head counting is often exclusionary. It doesn't tell the full picture because people are crossing back and forth. This has been very influential on my own research. So my dissertation, it's called On Both Sides by Turns. This is an actual quote where someone is describing their loyalty in such a way. But I found a township within my case study region where more than 90% of the male population capable of bearing arms had switched sides at least once by the end of the war, right? So this is a different American Revolution than a lot of people might remember, right? This is a war where loyalties and ideologies, they may be more fluid, right? They're not necessarily fixed and steadfast within one point of view, right? In the middle of a civil war being fought between Americans, right? So this is what I find very groundbreaking with Todd's research, and I'm very excited to see where it will take him in coming years. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce Todd and to moderate for his talk this evening. So thank you very much, and Todd, take it away.
Justin, thank you so much. That was incredible. I've never had such a lengthy and wonderful introduction. So I thank you very much for that. Yes, this presentation was originally set up over 10 years ago for the company of military historians at their national meeting in King of Prussia. So I needed something that was Valley Forge related, and I decided to come up with this. And I have actually not presented anything related to this in 10 years. So I want to thank you and thank Molly and everybody for having me today with this. It's a pleasure, and especially on a cold and desolate night that I'm having, and I imagine a lot of you are having right now. It's good to be inside. So without further ado, let's get started here. All right. Set up the old PowerPoint, and I trust everybody can see that now. Okay. All right. So let's get started. Loyalist research, a study of those Americans who openly supported King George and the British government during the War of the Revolution, 1775 to 1783, has largely focused on the belief that allegiances were unchanging during the conflict. Once a loyalist, always a loyalist. As you just heard Justin explaining, that's been the conventional wisdom. But by the same logic, those supporters of Congress and the new United States were true to their allegiance throughout the war, perhaps with one famous major general as the notable exception. And I'm sure many of you will recognize our friend from Connecticut in the miniature there. The American Revolution was as much civil war as anything, more complex than the conflict of 1861-1865. Not only were neighbors against neighbors, family against family, but it was becoming clear that thousands of men served on both sides at one time or another, some more than once. This is not a new revelation. What is becoming more apparent, however, is the scope of the situation, as reflects geography, numbers, and periods of time. Call this the American Vicars of Bray. In 1779, a British officer, most likely a British officer in New York City, wrote a new version of a song, The Vicars of Bray, which refers to somebody fitting one side over the other and going back and forth. I believe the song ends, let's see, how does it end? And so Congress shall, my king shall be, unless the time should alter. So the British were always a little upset about the fluctuation of loyalties. For this particular study, the Philadelphia campaign of 1777-1778 was considered the most suitable for research. The primary reason for this conclusion being the availability of existing records for both the Continental Army and the Provincial Corps during this period, something not possible for earlier or later periods, at least on as wide a scope. And keep in mind, most people, when they look at these units, they look at the four main groups of infantry and 3 troops of cavalry raised in Philadelphia during that time: the Pennsylvania Loyalists, the Maryland Loyalists, the Roman Catholic Volunteers, the West Jersey Volunteers, the Philadelphia Light Dragoons, and the Bucks County Light Dragoons. But there's a whole lot more to this story. The key tantalizing piece of evidence in showing the extent of the disaffection in Washington's army that campaign comes from Joseph Galloway, a former delegate to the Continental Congress. Galloway had come over to the British in December 1776, later joining Sir William Howe on the Philadelphia expedition. Upon the capture of the city, Galloway was appointed by Howe as superintendent of the Philadelphia police. In this office, he tendered oaths of allegiance to the inhabitants of the city and all those seeking refuge within it. Galloway, assisted by Philadelphia merchant and loyalist Enoch Story, were engaged in, quote, making out weekly returns of all recruits attested with the names of deserters from the rebel army and navy, as well as the inhabitants who had taken the oaths of allegiance. While Galloway's and Story's book of named deserters has very sadly not been located, an abstract with some of its information does, and this is what fascinates me. Galloway's ledger tally of Continental deserters was as follows. This is how many deserters were coming into Philadelphia and being prepared, meeting Galloway in his office. October 1777, 300. November 1777, 187. December, 100. January 1778. January 152. February 132. March 180. April 106. May 104. And June, up to June 17th, when it was evacuated, 28, for a total of 1,289 soldiers. This figure did not include an additional 61 wagoners, 391 sailors, and 603 militiamen, plus 2,003 inhabitants. Now, one of particular interest was concerning the Battle of Brandywine, which, of course, from September of 1777. And this involved a guy up on your screen there named David Sproat, a loyalist from Pennsylvania, and appointed by Howe as acting commissary of prisoners. He was the first to quantify and identify the nationalities of the Continental Army prisoners in their possession. Sproat created a return of Continental Army prisoners taken at Brandywine based on nationality. Of the 359 Continentals taken, 134 were from Ireland, 65 England, 9 Scotland, 16 Germany, 3 from France, and 1 each from Russia, Switzerland, and Guernsey. 82 were native-born Americans, while 3 were born at sea. According to Sproat, most of the Europeans were indentured servants, while the Americans were, and I quote, vagrants of the country. Of the militia, whose numbers taken were not noted, they were simply referred to as, quote, the mere dregs of the people. Galloway also took note of the nationality of deserters coming in. Of 1,134 deserters who noted their nationality, 492 were Irish, 283 Americans, 206 English, 88 Germans, 56 Scottish, 5 French, and 4 wayward Canadians. Nationalities for the 354 sailors that had registered were proportionally similar. Significantly, Galloway estimated that perhaps 1/3 more had come into Philadelphia and bypassed the registration process. So he thinks he's only seeing 2/3 of the people who come in. The other third are enlisting in corps they first meet with, enlisting on board the Royal Navy or a privateer or the civil branches, or finding a job in the city or a girl in the city, who knows? But he thinks he's only seeing 2/3 of them. With 3 significant victories and numerous skirmishes, the British had over 800 prisoners in their custody. Provincial officers made overtures receptive to recruit these guys, some to facilitate a return. Some guys wanted to return to the Continental Army and thought maybe enlisting in a provincial regiment would get them that way. Others had a completely different path, though. And it was easy to tell when the bulk of prisoners enlisted, as it was often on the same day. For instance, November 6, 1777, appears to have been an active day for recruiting prisoners for the Maryland Loyalists, based on the numbers enlisted on that particular date. Now, these were the prisoners I was able to identify based on Continental Army muster rolls. And that's hard because the muster rolls for the Continental Army at this time are it was one of the best periods, but there's so many were missing. A lot of Pennsylvania units missing, a lot of artillery units missing. So this is just, there were many more prisoners than this taken in these particular battles, but these were the ones I was able to identify by name, regiment, date, etc., and follow them through. And you can see by the different numbers there that I could identify. Germantown is always a big one because of one whole Virginia regiment basically being captured. And of those 674 prisoners that I was able to identify in Continental Army muster rolls, I could identify 126 enlisting in provincial regiments in Philadelphia. Richard Jesper was one such person enlisted out of prison. At a later trial, he related the story of his capture, his enlistment in the Pennsylvania Loyalists, his desertion from them, and subsequent apprehension. He went back to the Continental Army, and then he was captured by the British. So here was his story at his court-martial. Quote, "He was a servant to Colonel Antill of Congress's own regiment and was taken prisoner at the Battle of Germantown and put in the Provost Guard, where Captain Thomas Stevens found him. That upon Captain Stevens asking him what countryman he was and whether he would enlist, he replied that he would rather wait upon some gentleman. And Captain Stevens said that he would inquire if any gentleman wanted such a man, and that he afterwards took him out of jail to wait upon himself. The Captain Stevens gave him small sums of money at different times, which he thought he had earned as a servant and not as a soldier, and never signed any pay list, that he had no thoughts of going off till Smith persuaded him to attempt to go home in some ship, as there was a slur lay upon his character in the regiment. But Smith being apprehended, he could find no opportunity of going off, and therefore went into the Jerseys, where he lived as a servant with a Colonel Ogden, in which capacity he was and not in arms, or serving as a soldier, when he was taken by a party of the guards." Well, that's interesting if we take that all at face value. But being a researcher, we don't, do we? No. It does not bear scrutiny. If he had been a servant of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Antill, as he was not in that capacity at Germantown, as Antill had been taken prisoner 6 weeks earlier during Sullivan's raid on Staten Island. So Antill was no longer with the regiment. He was a prisoner of the British at that time. The muster rolls of the Pennsylvania Loyalists show Jesper enlisted 20 October 1777 as a soldier in the ranks, from which he deserted on 7 February 1778. After his desertion from the Pennsylvania Loyalists, he eventually enlisted in Captain John Flayhaven's company of the 1st New Jersey Regiment, Continental unit, joining them on 24 May 1778, and being listed as taken prisoner the following month. The muster rolls of the Pennsylvania Loyalists show he rejoined that corps on 27 June 1778, the day before the Battle of Monmouth, and was found lodged in the provost wearing a blue coat faced red, the uniform of the 1st New Jersey. For the crime of desertion, the British found Jesper guilty and sentenced him to receive 1,000 lashes on the bare back with a cat o' nine tails. Whether he actually received all or part of the punishment is not recorded. But whatever the reason, Jesper would go on to actually become a useful soldier. He served with the Pennsylvania Loyalists throughout their tenure at Pensacola, the capital of West Florida, where he was killed in action on 4 May 1781 during the Spanish siege of the garrison. Now, we talked about prisoners. What about deserters? I looked at the muster rolls of the Continental Army as best I could for that period. The period we're talking about is the British landing of Head of Elk until the Battle of Monmouth. That's what I loosely defined as the Philadelphia campaign. So that's the period from very late August 1777 to late June 1778, those muster rolls. And these are the number of deserters that I found on those muster rolls. Again, there's many muster rolls missing. So this is what I could find. And I was able to identify 1,511 deserters, of whom 85, for whatever reason, went back to their old units, whether they were apprehended or had a change of heart. 85 went back. But I could identify 310 enlisted in provincial units in Philadelphia. Now, these deserters presented an interesting problem to those then and now who feel the need to label groups of people with what were they considered, rebels or loyalists. Justin went on very well about that. So do we call these people rebels, or are they loyalists, or are they something else? The question was actually asked in 1779 by Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe, the commanding officer of the Queen's Rangers. Simcoe, since October 16, 1777, had under his command the colorful Captain John Ferdinand D. Smith, who during the 6 preceding weeks had attempted to raise an independent corps called the Royal Hunters. On that date, however, his unit, the strength of 2 companies, was attached to the Queen's Rangers and by Simcoe fully incorporated into them. Smith, in 1779, had brought Simcoe up on a number of charges concerning this and other things. During his trial, Simcoe noted that Smith's company, quote, being in general rebel deserters and not loyalists, as he had been ordered to raise, was one reason of his being sent to the Rangers, for they having a general order in their favor to enlist rebel deserters, and all other corps being excluded, had a right to any men of that description that Captain Smith had enlisted. Well, that's interesting. Now, the Q&A during Simcoe's trial provides an excellent description of recruiting at Philadelphia at that time. Now, these are the questions being asked of Smith. Quote, question, you had orders to enlist no men but of approved loyalty and attachment to government. Do rebel deserters come under the denomination of approved loyalists? Answer, I had orders to enlist any men that I thought good, but to be particular careful, they were so. I conceive a great number of men who have deserted from the rebels have been loyalists from the beginning and forced into their service, and who have deserted from them the first opportunity, instances of which I have in my own company. Question, you say you propose to raise men who were well acquainted with the roads throughout the country. Do rebel deserters come under that description? Answer, I conceive they do. Question, what do you mean by saying you refused many men as improper persons that other corps must enlist? Answer, a great number of men came to me at Philadelphia. When having examined them, I conceived some only wished to enlist for the sake of provision, clothing, or some other sinister purpose, on which suspicion, though their appearance was ever so good, I did not enlist them. That's interesting. And yes, what Simcoe was saying, that the Queen's Rangers, one of the very few corps that could enlist deserters. In actuality, every corps enlisted deserters. Now, while few of the deserters left behind written records of their actions, one appears to somewhat confirm Captain Smith's opinion. Gershom Hilliard of Piscataway, New Jersey, entered the Philadelphia campaign as a sergeant in Captain William Pyatt's company of the 1st New Jersey Regiment. Muster rolls of that corps show he deserted sometime in October 1777. After the war, applying to Parliament for compensation for property losses, Hilliard related he joined the British from loyalty and attachment to his king and country. After serving some time in the Secret Service, Hilliard enlisted as a sergeant in Emmerich Chasseurs, in which he was later promoted to quartermaster. He remained with the British for the remainder of the war and was in London in 1784. Now, the Royal Artillery was perpetually short of artillerymen. In April 1777, to compensate for this, the entire 2nd Battalion New Jersey Volunteers was attached to the Royal Artillery to plug the gap. At the same time, the Royal Artillery recruited Americans at New York City, enlisting some 70 men. Numbers of Continental artillerymen deserted during the Philadelphia campaign, many of whom ended up in the New Jersey Volunteers and thereby attached to the Royal Artillery. The commander of the Royal Artillery, General Patterson, did not want them to enlist in the Royal Artillery per se. He didn't trust them. They were fine if they enlisted in the NJV and served with the artillery, but not for the Royal Artillery per se. He didn't particularly care for the ones he got at New York. Now, not every desertion is initially successful. James Dilworth of Moylan's Light Dragoons was acquitted of, quote, desertion and attempting to go to the enemy in September 1777. His second attempt was more successful, enlisting on 18 March 1778 in the Maryland Loyalists. He died in their service at West Florida 25 months later. William Shoemaker of the 2nd New Jersey Regiment was apprehended as part of a Loyalist attempt to reach Staten Island in September 1777. Returned to his regiment, he was taken prisoner with a small detachment of the corps at Squan much later on in April 1780, starting his career in the Loyalist 1st Battalion New Jersey Volunteers, the corps that captured him. 2 months later, Shoemaker ended up engaged directly against his old regiment at the Battle of Springfield and was wounded in the battle, making him an invalid for the rest of his life. His wounds were serious enough to require a stay at the British Army's General Hospital in New York through the remainder of 1780, and his being an invalid through the end of the war. Beyond that, his whereabouts are a mystery. When the men of his battalion embarked on board vessels for the River St. John in Nova Scotia, present-day New Brunswick, Shoemaker may not have been among them. Although listed at present with his company at their final muster at Newtown, Long Island on 22 August 1783, the former Continental does not appear to have received any land grant in the Maritimes. A statement by his major, Thomas Millage, said he had, quote, not the smallest doubt of Shoemaker and another soldier, Painter Stockley, joining the corps when it embarked for Nova Scotia. Why such a specific statement was made is unknown. According to family history, Shoemaker and his wife were living in Hamilton Township, Pennsylvania, by 1786. At the time of his pension application in 1833, he was a 90-year-old veteran residing in Fairfield County, Ohio, where he remained until his death 3 years later. And yes, he was receiving a pension from the taxpayers of the United States of America for his service in the Continental Army. Now, some of the Continental Army deserters that were coming into the British were actually initially recruits for Loyalist regiments. In September 1777, a group of about 130 Loyalist recruits, led by, amongst others, Ensign James Moody, who you see there on your screen, of the 5th Battalion New Jersey Volunteers, attempted to march from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and northwest New Jersey to the British forces on Staten Island. This group was intercepted on or about 18 September 1777 and dispersed short of its goal, with Moody and a handful of others reaching the British. The majority of recruits were brought to and initially imprisoned in Trenton and then Morristown. At Morristown, 37 of the Loyalists were tried and sentenced to death for high treason against the state of New Jersey. 2 warrant officers, James Iliffe and John Nee, were executed in February 1778 in view of the others. For the remaining condemned prisoners, quote, the love of life prevailed, and they enlisted in the New Jersey Continental line. An examination of the muster rolls for the New Jersey line shows that the prisoners enlisted in the 1st, 3rd, and 4th New Jersey regiments. James Moody later asserted that all but 3 or 4 eventually found their way to the British. By correlating the muster rolls of the New Jersey Continentals with those of the provincial troops of the British, we can verify Moody's assertion. These men made their way into both Philadelphia and New York, as well as the British march across New Jersey in 1778, the majority joining the 1st and 3rd battalions of New Jersey Volunteers, or the Maryland Loyalists. This guy is rather interesting. And by the way, the person we're talking about here, John Biddle, that's not him on your screen. There is no image that I'm aware of, but people like to see pictures on screen, so there's a nice red coat for you. Before deserting to the British in January 1778, John Biddle was a surveyor and commissary for Pennsylvania. He apparently made a detailed survey of Washington's position at, you guessed it, Valley Forge, and headed straight to Philadelphia with it. Continental Congressman William Dyer, upon learning of Biddle's desertion, wrote George Washington that, quote, before Biddle went in, he told a person confidentially that he could put the enemy in a way of investing in it in such a manner as to cut off your communication with the country and thereby prevent the supply of provisions, etc. So British obviously did not do that, and I've never been able to locate such a plan, a physical plan, survey, whatever you want to call it, but one was out there, and it must have made had a little consternation. Now, Washington did go to great pains to stop the bleeding from the army. You're losing, over 1,500 men to desertion, probably well over 2,000, and that's a lot of people. So floggings of 100 lashes were common, although in several cases executions were necessary, such as that of Corporal Thomas Hartnett of the 2nd Pennsylvania, taken at Pioli and joined the enemy. So he got the death sentence when he was caught. Now, this is not the case of a deserter coming into the British, but a British deserter who went out to the Americans, who I decided to include in here just because it was a lot of fun. And I like to have a little fun from time to time. In any case, Martin Hurley was a deserter from the British 44th Regiment of Foot. He deserted at Boston in 1775 as an enlisted man, and he became an ensign in apparently our new favorite regiment, the 1st New Jersey Regiment of the Continental line. In the attack on Germantown, he was shot and captured, leading his men against the Chew Mansion, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Well, he was shot and captured by, you guessed it, some guys from the 44th Regiment of Foot. And he was court-martialed by the British. And in his defense, he was trying to say, did you actually see me leading this attack? And one of the British officers said, yes, you were waving your hat and waving your sword. And when we picked you up on the field, you had a commission signed by John Hancock in your pocket. He had no more further questions. The British executed him within 48 hours. So, if you desert, do not lead an attack. That's an important safety tip for you kids out there. A significant collection located at the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration is the pension application files for veterans of the war. Starting in 1818, the United States Congress passed a series of laws providing pensions for veterans and later widows of veterans from the Revolution. These files are useful for what they say, imply, or do not say. An example would be the application of Daniel Gill, a soldier of Hartley's regiment, who stated that, quote, "At the Battle of Iron Hill, I was taken a prisoner by the enemy and was held by them 9 months and made my escape from the enemy at Charleston, South Carolina. And after having thus escaped again entered into the service of the United States." Now, at face value, this appears to be a patriotic soldier who served his country, was captured in battle, then escaped from the enemy far from home. But the events described need to be examined for their historical accuracy, then checked against the provincial forces for possible references. In Gill's case, it was not difficult. Battle of Iron Hill, or Couch's Bridge, was fought in Delaware on September 3rd, 1777. If Gill was truthful and accurate in his statement, he would have effected his escape in South Carolina around June 1778. The problem with this, of course, was that there were no British in South Carolina in 1778, and prisoners were not removed out of their districts. Gill's tenure as a prisoner actually lasted no more than 3 months when he enlisted in the Maryland Loyalists, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Chalmers. Gill, promoted to corporal, sailed with his new corps for Pensacola, West Florida, stopping en route at Jamaica, where he deserted on 16 September 1778. Gill disappears, but apparently returns to America, where at New York on July 29, 1780, he enlisted in the 2nd Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers, now no longer serving with the Royal Artillery. The part of Gill's story that is true is that he left the British service in South Carolina. After joining the New Jersey Volunteers, Gill volunteered for service in the newly formed Light Infantry Company of the battalion, which company was then attached to the Corps of Provincial Light Infantry. This unit, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Watson Tadswell Watson, yeah, that's his name, embarked for Virginia in early October 1780 as part of Major General Alexander Leslie's expedition, staying there but a month or so before moving on by sea to South Carolina. After reaching South Carolina, the Corps marched into the high hills of Santee, where Gill did indeed desert on January 27, 1781. Whether or not he actually re-entered the service of the United States is anyone's guess. There are many other similar cases found throughout this collection, particularly for those Continentals who surrendered in 1780 at Charleston and Camden and later served at Jamaica, as Justin's friend did, as part of the Duke of Cumberland's regiment or other similar corps. British judge advocate records provide several accounts of former deserters' troubles with their new army, none more serious than Edward Warren, a deserter from the 1st New York Regiment who enlisted in the Roman Catholic Volunteers at Philadelphia. After his corps was drafted in 1778, Warren entered into the Volunteers of Ireland, from whom he deserted on March 28, 1779. He was not seen again for several months until brought back into New York City by HMS Rainbow, which had taken him amongst the crew of a rebel privateer. Warren had the dubious distinction of being the only provincial soldier executed at New York during the command of Sir Henry Clinton. So you got a guy here, deserts from the 1st New York, goes into Philadelphia, enlists in a Loyalist regiment, deserts from them eventually, ends up in a rebel privateer captured by the Royal Navy, and the British decide he's going to be made the example of. Some deserters returned to their ranks only to desert to the British later, whether at New York or Charleston. Stevens, a soldier of the 1st New York, deserted for 2 weeks at Philadelphia, only to do it again outside of New York in November 1780, this time joining the American Legion and providing intelligence to the British. Now, on the right is the information he provided concerning West Point and troop dispositions. Each deserter brought bits and pieces of information that the British Adjutant General's office wove into an intelligence tapestry. Some of the deserters had their new careers in the British Army cut short, literally in the case of John Crawford. Crawford deserted from the 2nd Connecticut Regiment on June 10, 1778, and enlisted as a sergeant in Emmerich Chasseurs 4 days later. In a severe action with Indians in the Bronx on August 31st, 1778, Crawford lost an arm, effectively ending his military career. That's his actual discharge on the screen there. He continued on as an invalid until the Corps was drafted exactly a year later, soon after which he was discharged from the army and sent to England in quest of a pension at the Soldiers' Hospital of Chelsea. And that's the discharge he showed them, as addition to having only one arm. By contrast, some deserters not only maintained a new sense of loyalty to King George, but chose the British Army as their career. William Jackson, a soldier in the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment, was taken prisoner September 21st, 1777, at Major General Charles Gray's victory at Paoli. Not choosing to remain a prisoner, he enlisted in the Queen's Rangers, with whom he served the remainder of the war. At the termination of the conflict, apparently enjoying a soldier's life, he enlisted in the British 3rd Regiment of Foot, serving until discharge because of wounds received at St. Vincent in 1798, almost 21 years to the day of his capture at Paoli. And there you see his discharge also on the screen. Shortly after the Battle of Brandywine, there were 543 provincials serving with Howe's army, divided among the Queen's Rangers, 2nd Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers, and Guides and Pioneers. By the time of the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, there were 2,016 provincials serving with Clinton's force, not including detachments of recruits and baggage guards sent on ship to New York. And of course, that does not take into account those who died, deserted, or discharged during the campaign. So almost 4 times as many provincials at the end of the campaign as at the beginning of the campaign. The numbers shown here reflect the known enlistments during the Philadelphia campaign for the Corps raised there. These were the units I initially mentioned. These numbers are based on the muster rolls taken at the time. That for the Bucks County Light Dragoons is actually shown for their provision return at Monmouth in 78, as no rolls exist for them prior to 1779. Now here we see how units not raised in Philadelphia, but who served there or recruited there, fared with recruits, again, based on existing muster rolls. The Guides and Pioneers having no rolls until the end of 1778, their numbers are those shown also at Monmouth. This corps was a very interesting unit. They actually disbanded in Philadelphia on December 24th, 1777, and were re-raised the following day, but not with all the people. Anyone who wanted out of the unit at that point simply didn't re-enlist. It was one of the unique one-year units that most others were not. Everybody else in the provincials was raised for the duration of the war, except for them. And why, I don't know. Other units definitely recruited in Philadelphia, but without the benefit of definitive records showing who enlisted, it was simply impossible to ascertain how many took the King's shilling. And you'll see some of these units up there. They all enlisted men in Philadelphia, which probably included some more deserters or prisoners, but we just don't know. Now, the next 3 slides show how many known prisoners and deserters enlisted into which corps. This is by no means complete, as the records, as I mentioned before, are very incomplete. But I think it's a good study. Representative of the many rank and file soldiers was James Dyer. Dyer was a soldier in the 2nd Pennsylvania when he deserted them the day following the bloody defeat at Paoli. About 3 weeks later, Dyer enlisted out of prison into Captain John Smith's Royal Hunters, which corps, as mentioned, was almost immediately absorbed into the Queen's Rangers. The 30-year-old Irishman served with the Rangers throughout the war, surrendering with his corps at Yorktown in 1781. As a deserter, he was able to obtain passage to New York on board HMS Bonetta, where he remained on parole until the final exchange of prisoners in May 1783. After the disbanding of his corps on October 10, 1783, Dyer eventually settled on Regimental Block 5 at Queensberry, New Brunswick. He and his wife Margaret were living in Brighton Township, Carleton County, in 1838 when he applied for a pension to the province of New Brunswick as an old soldier, being, quote, in indigent circumstances. Now, these are how many deserters and prisoners enlisted in each corps. I just want to make one more mention here. Pennsylvania Loyalists always get a bad rap, as being recruited out of so many deserters, while the Maryland Loyalists are always held up back then as the corps consisting of nothing but true loyalists. Well, take a look at that. 85 of the Maryland Loyalists, at least, and undoubtedly more, were deserters and prisoners enlisted out of the Continental ranks, almost double that of the Pennsylvania Loyalists. So they got a bad rap back then. Here you can see, again, some of the others. We know from a few of the recruiting parties that ended up. And again, not even a lot of these units were not even at Philadelphia. A lot of them were not in Philadelphia. They just had recruiting parties there. Now, even after the campaign was over, some deserters and prisoners who had returned, along with others who had disappeared into the shadows, eventually made their way into provincial units. Going through all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of muster rolls, you see a name, you're like, oh, I know that name, but he didn't desert during Philadelphia. And then you look later on because you know that name and you just have to find out. And sure enough, he deserted 2 years later and ended up in a provincial unit. So it's really such a fun area of study. So if you're really bored during the pandemic and want to looking for something to do, sure, by all means, go for it. Now, we've talked a lot about records, particularly muster rolls and pension applications. Now, this is a muster roll of Captain Pyatt's company of the 1st New Jersey Regiment. You've heard me mention Pyatt's company. And look at who we have on here just for fun. Why, there's Martin Hurley. And interesting, if you look at the muster roll there, he says ensign, killed 4th October last. So the Americans think he's actually killed at Germantown. They don't realize he was not dead yet, but he soon would be. And over here, under sergeants, we have, there's Gershom Hilliard. It says he deserted. Well, we know he deserted, or we know where he ended up. And if we go down here in this column here, we see Moses Locke. All right, and we see he was taken prisoner at Brandywine. Well, he also enlists in the Maryland Loyalists on November 6, 1777. But just for fun, further down here, that's Cornelius Cornine. Now, who's Cornelius Cornine? Cornelius Cornine was a New Jersey volunteer who was taken prisoner by the Continentals and enlisted out of prison to enlist in the Continental Army. So I recognize that name immediately. And interestingly, you have to understand, this is the age before internet. Well, back then was the age before the internet. And, we have so much more capability now to look at, what happened, but the other side had no idea. So, Moses Locke was probably listed as a prisoner by the Continental Army for the rest of the war. Same as Cornelius Cornine was listed as a prisoner of war, taken by the Americans for the rest of the war. So we have the benefit now to examine these things and, understand what happened a lot better than they did. And with that, thank you all very much. And Justin, I believe we have some time for questions here.
Yes. One of the first questions here, can you talk a little bit about the motivations of deserters, their incentives to sign up with the Loyalist regiment?
That's an outstanding question. Unfortunately, and you knew there was going to be an unfortunately coming here, most of these people, the vast majority of these people, do not state their reasons for doing so. Anyone who's researched the common soldier of the American Revolution knows that they don't leave a whole big paper trail. So unless somebody left a diary or something, we have no idea whatsoever. But if you were looking for a reason why you might want to leave an army, say at Valley Forge, where you're not adequately fed or clothed or paid, as opposed to joining a loyalist regiment at Philadelphia, where you would be fed and clothed and paid, those are strong inducements. Another inducement, enlisting into the provincial forces, which was popular among common soldiers, for the people who made up the rank and file soldier, is that they would get 100 acres of land at the end of the war. Now, you saw David Sproat had mentioned that a lot of these people were indentured servants, that they were captured at Brandywine. Now, if you're an indentured servant, you're definitely not a landowner. All right, you're the lower rung of society. So if you can go from a situation where you're an indentured servant to suddenly being a landowner with 100 acres of land, all your own, that's a pretty good deal. So those, I think, those are assumptions, but I think those are pretty good assumptions for why somebody might do that.
To piggyback off of that, the motivations of Continental Army soldiers, or really any patriot of the American Revolution, that is somewhat the defining question of this war. How did a group of people that at one point were patriots of the British Empire during the 7 Years' War, how did they end up supporting a rebellion? So the question of motivation, that is a big question. It goes both ways. Why would someone become a patriot versus why would they become a loyalist? So motivation is something that we can never really get down to it, but every historian tries. It is almost the central question of the war for American independence. A related question here is really, what do we call them? Are they mercenaries? The people that go back and forth, desert from one unit to another. We can't really call them patriots. We can't really call them loyalists. Neutral doesn't really fit. So are they protectionists? Can we call them mercenaries, or mercenary as an adjective? What are your thoughts on that?
I would call them soldiers. Understand that the 18th century is a period before a social safety net. If you're not working, if you're not doing something to earn your keep, you're not going to be fed. You're not going to be clothed. You're not going to have a roof over your head. And if someone was a soldier, what did they know how to do? They knew how to be a soldier. So because they left one side for the other, they're simply applying their trade with the other side. That might be a mercenary motivation. I tend to think of it more as a self-survival motivation. And you need to earn your bread. So if what you know is being a soldier, then simply being a soldier on the other side. So this question came up very early in my research, and I actually reached out to the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, and the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada for what they considered these people, or what they considered acceptable for their membership. The UEL, the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada, which for those who are not familiar is the Canadian equivalent of the DAR and the SAR rolled into one. They consider somebody a loyalist if at the end of the war they're a loyalist. All right, what came before may not be important. But in the others, I think it may have been the SAR, said that they had to have at all times, I remember that phrase, at all times, been patriotic to the American cause. And given the number of pension applications I have found of men who had served in provincial units, going back to the unit that Justin mentioned earlier, the Duke of Cumberland's regiment, I've gotten over 50 pension applications for guys who served in the Duke of Cumberland's regiment who were former Continental Army soldiers. And I know at SAR meetings where I've spoken, where I've talked about this, I can see a few people, getting a little nervous sitting around me. But I leave it for those organizations to determine, obviously, the qualifications for their membership and what they want to call them. To me, they're objects of study. They're all dead now. They don't care. So I call them soldiers. You guys can call them, what you wish.
There was a question. Can you elaborate a little bit about the Roman Catholic volunteers? As mostly people think that you have to be a Protestant to serve in British forces. Correct.
The British became, as the war went on, quite liberal in their policies concerning who could serve and who couldn't. But they enlisted the aid of a gentleman by the name of Alfred Clifton to raise a corps of none but the Roman Catholic faith, as they put it. And they even had some nifty belt plates with a cross on them, with a GR over the cross, that I've never seen anything quite like it before. The Roman Catholic Volunteers was supposed to have 400 or 500 men. They never got that many. They got up to around 300 men, never at one time. They had a lot of discipline problems, to put it mildly. A lot of guys deserted from them. They never really fought a battle. They were guarding the baggage on the march across New Jersey to New York. And two of their four captains, well, actually three of their four captains were court-martialed. In two cases, though, one captain was court-martialed for kicking another captain on the parade. And so he was court-martialed and cashiered by the British. And another captain was court-martialed and cashiered for suffering himself to be kicked upon the parade and not properly resenting it. So once they court-martialed over half the captains of the unit, they decided to get rid of them. And the men were drafted into other units, such as the Volunteers of Ireland and the British Legion and the Pennsylvania Loyalists and the Lancey's Brigade. So a very short-lived but interesting unit.
So I suppose another question, unless the listeners have any questions to add, but what's next? What research are you currently working on?
Oh, good question. I should have an article coming out in Journal of the American Revolution in the next couple of weeks. It was written for Black History Month, which we are into now. And for those folks who are not familiar with Journal of the American Revolution, I have to imagine anyone who is here tonight is, allthingsliberty.com, over 1,000 articles for free from folks like us who are writing out short pieces that are coming out. And the piece I just wrote that's coming out is on Black soldiers who served in the King's American Dragoons. Now, one of the things we didn't touch on were Black Loyalists tonight. The provincial forces were a white organization. That they didn't start that way. They started with anybody could enlist in them. But in January of 1777, Sir William Howe appointed an inspector general of provincial forces, a guy named Alexander Innes, who had been secretary to the royal governor down in South Carolina in 1775. And he noted, and not happily, that there were, quote, blacks, mulattoes, Indians, and sailors in the provincial forces. And Howe ordered that all of those people be discharged. Now, that did not include a company of Black pioneers. Now, Black pioneers were an all-Black organization except for the officers, and they did serve at Philadelphia. And they were more used as Department of Public Works people, cleaning the streets and that sort of thing. They're supposed to be working on fortifications and whatnot. But after the ring of redoubts and whatnot around Philadelphia was done, they settled into more mundane tasks. But that being said, in 1781, Benjamin Thompson was raising a new cavalry corps called the King's American Dragoons, and he found innovative ways to sneak Blacks into the corps that did not violate Inspector General Innes's orders, which had more to do with them men carrying muskets than anything else. So that's what the article is going to be on. There are some other things that I am working on at the moment concerning, really a lot of what we discussed today and related material, perhaps more with a naval bent to it than a soldier bent to it. But it's a fascinating study, I think. One of the things that I like to do, I always bow to the my betters. I'm not someone with letters after their name. To me, the David Library was the place of my education. That's where you found me. That was a common occurrence, and I was one of the last people to turn off the lights in that place a year ago, December, and which broke my heart. But that being said, it's the never-ending curiosity for those folks out there who want to do more. Anybody can do this. I'm not bright, right? Anybody can do this. You just need the number one quality of curiosity. All right, just seeing something and wanting to know more about it, not accepting it at face value. Even primary research. I'm a primary research nut. I love, that's what you got to use, but don't take it at face value. Corroborate it. There's a lot of cool accounts we have that are only by one source. Look at them, with a jaundiced eye. Is that really what happened? If something doesn't seem right, maybe it isn't. We all like to think of our ancestors as all fine, upstanding people, which I'm sure everyone in this audience, their ancestors were. But for the folks not here tonight, their ancestors may not have always told the truth. That's where people like we come in and try to verify. With the Russian saying, "Trust but verify."
Excellent. Well, thank you sincerely, Todd. This has been fantastic.
It's been my pleasure. I wanted to thank you guys so very much for having me. This has been a fun night. I've been looking forward to it, and it beats being outside shoveling.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. And in closing, I have a flurry of well-earned thank yous. First, I want to sincerely thank Todd for joining us and Justin for serving as our moderator. And there are many Valley Forge Park Alliance volunteers who also make this event possible and get all the news out to you about it happening. And I also want to thank our sponsor, the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation, who without them, this certainly would not exist. So I also want to thank you. Thank you for participating in our discussion tonight. And I hope you'll join us on March 2nd for our next speaker event, which will be focusing on rationalizing epidemics, meanings and uses of American Indian mortality. It will be presented by Dr. David S. Jones, MD, the A. Bernard Ackerman Professor of the Culture of Medicine at Harvard University. And last, I want to thank all of the Valley Forge Park Alliance members for your wonderful support. Truly, you make our mission possible every day. Thank you very much. And I wish you a good night from Valley Forge, and I hope to see you in March. Good night.